Let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at University College Dublin. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on France 24. As we were just hearing, the US President Joe Biden is due back in Washington tonight. Do you think that long trip he did was actually worth it?
I have to think we wait and see. But no, I don't think it was successful in continuing. I think the pretty solid work that had been done by his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and indeed by other members of the international community. Let's remind ourselves what the two aims of that diplomacy over the past week have been. The first aim was to convey to Israel that most of the international community believes that Hamas has crossed a line with its mass murder of Israeli civilians, and that it has to be isolated, and Iran has to be isolated, and that Hamas eventually has to go. The question, however, and this was the second aim of Biden's trip, is to really ask the Israelis, but how do you get Hamas removed from leadership in Gaza so you have the space to try to pursue stability and security? And the implication, or in fact the message from the Americans privately was, you don't do it by a ground invasion, and you don't do it through widespread bombing that's killing many civilians. And of course, the problem is whoever carried out the bombing of al-Ahli hospital, Israeli bombing and attacks in Gaza since Hamas's initial mass murders have killed 3,300 Palestinians, many of them civilians. So that space of sympathy for Israel and that space to try to isolate Hamas has closed off. It's actually driven Gazan civilians to treat Hamas as their only protector. So what do you have to do, given that Biden's visit, including, I think, some very unfortunate statements this morning alongside Prime Minister Netanyahu? I think you have to not only show Gazan civilians that you are announcing humanitarian aid, you have got to get that aid into the Gaza Strip. You've got to get it in through the Rafah crossing. Secondly, you have got to get Israel to pull back from the intensity of its strikes. And then thirdly, you can begin to discuss movement towards a ceasefire with the longer term aid of using political and economic methods to try to isolate Hamas rather than trying to crush them with an all-out invasion.
Yeah, I mean, that siege on Gaza is viewed by many as being collective punishment of 2.4 million people, no food, no water, no electricity for days, a healthcare system that's collapsing. Then what happened last night, which a lot of people, as we've been saying, believe was Israel's fault, even if the evidence that the United States and Israel are showing would suggest otherwise. And the optics really don't look great for Israel and therefore, by extension, the United States. And therefore, wouldn't President Biden have been well advised to perhaps sound like the good cop as far as the Palestinians are concerned on those sorts of issues?
Well, let me give you an episode this morning because I was actually listening to the press conference live, working with another outlet, when Joe Biden started by saying, well, we have to understand Palestinian civilians are suffering. And he started by talking about Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had received a letter from, and he was going to continue to say, I think, a person in Gaza. But then he cut himself off. He claimed that his time was short. In fact, he wrote himself back because he thought, I'm standing here next to Mr. Netanyahu, I can't say this. That was a very unfortunate image, followed by his declaration, his firm declaration, that the other side did the hospital bombing. Now, if you were a Gazan civilian, or if you're someone who's wondering what is going on, you would really question whether the United States was going all in with Netanyahu at that moment. Now, President Biden did row back his statements this afternoon in a speech. He did call for Palestinian civilians to be distinguished from Hamas, to recognize that they've suffered. But there's a little bit of too little, too late. And I've got to add one other thing that you'll know about at France 24, and that is in the Security Council, there is a resolution drafted by Brazil calling for a humanitarian aid and for a ceasefire. 12 of 15 countries voted for that resolution, including France. 2 abstained. The only one that voted no, vetoing the resolution, the United States. So there has got to be a lot of private work behind the scenes, talking to Arab countries, talking to European allies about how you move forward to close off Hamas. But first, you have to get some distance by having this conflict de-escalate And the American public message has got to be a lot better than it was today to
Yeah.
match what might be said in private.
Well, it does, because, I mean, if you just listen to, I mean, anyone who listens to what's being said in the Arab world will see that in this war of information, well, in the information aspect of this war, I should say, you know, Hamas is coming out on top, and the United States and Israel are looking and sounding rather isolated, at least in that region. Just lastly, I just want to ask you, I mean, we've obviously been talking about events these last few days together, and you've probably been talking about this for much of your career. Professor, do you think that we're in sort of uncharted territory now as far as this 75-year-old conflict is concerned?
In one sense, in the age of social media, as you've been pointing out here, it's uncharted because everything moves much more quickly. In one sense, we're in uncharted territory because of the fears that this could be a conflict expanding not just on the southern flank with Gaza, but with Hezbollah in Lebanon and in other countries like Syria. But no, let's go back to the basics. You have got two peoples in one area of land. One of them is Israeli, Jews and Arabs and Christians. One of them is Palestinians of many different backgrounds. The fundamental is that these people should have their own states and be able to live in peace and in security without their leaders attacking each other. Unfortunately, the leaders continue to get beyond that basic. And I'll just cut to the chase and tell you right now that for us to get back to the basics of protecting civilians, it is my belief that you have to create the space where Hamas has to go as a leadership in Gaza, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has to go as Prime Minister of Israel.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Professor Scott Lucas at University College Dublin, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us again this evening.